Good evening, and thank you for braving the threat of a tornado to come and see me tonight. I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Laura. That was a lovely introduction. I want to show something to you. I've spent the afternoon with Bob G. quite wonderfully taking me through the Clinton Library, and I have here the proof that I am not carrying a gun. I have come here tonight armed. I'm armed with my speech, and I'm armed with goodwill for all of you, and I hope that I am armed with some things that you can take away and think are interesting in the future, but I am not carrying a gun. Okay. I'm delighted to be back in Little Rock, a preoccupying city in my young life, where my husband was from and where he asked me to marry him, where I did marry him in the First Presbyterian Church. His grandfather ran the Marion Hotel, and the stories from that life in Little Rock were, well, intoxicating. To return here to see old friends, Frank and Deanne Newell, who are here, who I have known almost as long as I've known my husband, it's a great pleasure to revisit that early life, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to get to talk to you about what I think are important matters. When Nikolai asked me to speak tonight, he said I could talk about how great communities are conceived and built. That was when I thought of the idea that a good plan is not a quest for certainty. I was really pleased about talking about that, and he also said I could talk about regional planning. But then I reread his letter, and I found the fearsome embedded phrase, which told me you were also interested in hearing about increasing sustainability in Central Arkansas. There is the viral word, sustainability, the current planning slogan. I've tried hard not to use such slogans in these years of teaching, practicing, and writing about planning because I don't think the urban problems planners are trained to deal with can be constructively addressed by abstract words. But my topic is in part sustainability. I guess you'd never get far away from getting topics. And so tonight I've appended the word to my working vocabulary for the sake of talking to you all. Actually, your interest in regionalism is close to mine. My first planning job was to be a research professor at Rutgers. Regional government in San Francisco had been my dissertation subject, and I imagined that I would advance my new logic for regional planning from the high ground Rutgers offered, and that policymakers would listen to what I had to say and do the right thing. That, of course, wasn't what Rutgers had in mind. Instead, I was to research rent control programs in Washington, D.C., and conduct field surveys of artists and other pioneers living in old manufacturing lofts in Soho in New York City. I was assigned to write about using remote sensing technology to determine where new suburban development should be allowed. I gave talks, sat on panels, wrote reports, and figured, confident as only a newly minted PhD can, that my work would be noticed by mayors, city councils, and county commissioners who would eagerly seek me out about what public policies I thought they should enact. It didn't quite happen that way. Even with the PhD, I didn't know much about how my advice would be taught at the ground level of local politics. Eventually, I did come to advise policymakers when I left the academy and became city planning director in Missoula, Montana, and later in New Orleans. But in neither place was regional planning of much interest to city leaders. Instead, my role was to render workable, beneficial, or at least not problematic, the effects of land use decisions on the city's existing neighborhoods and on its thriving businesses and on its hope for a more bountiful community. In New Orleans, this meant figuring out how to, quote, use my professional training to shoehorn Harrah's Casino into a graceful 300-year-old city renowned for its successes in urban preservation, but infamous for high rates of urban crime, a long-standing problem that gambling would probably worsen. My role as planning director also meant writing a new zoning ordinance. I'd never done such a thing, and explaining to angry residents why my staff had selected a site close to their neighborhood for a welfare office because many welfare clients lived in that neighborhood and needed those services. Even though, as I say, I never learned how to do such things in graduate school, I had learned a standard of usefulness at Michigan. In the 19th century, and long before planning was even a profession, Frederick Law Olmsted had written that plans should make the ordinary citizen able to live and labor under conditions as favorable to health, happiness, and productive efficiency as his means permit. First and foremost, I was an ordinary citizen, and as a planner, I was drawn to this standard because by leaving no citizen out of its purview, it sought equitable community life. This is the intention of planning communities as I have practiced it. Nikolai's suggesting that my remarks include sustainability implies that from my experience, I can say something useful about the entire notion of sustainability. I very much appreciate Laura's generous introduction this evening, but my background might not immediately suggest I would have something to say about sustainability. True, New Orleans, where I was planning director for almost 10 years, is a city subject to devastating hurricanes 6 months of every year, and one might think that planning for such disasters could properly connect to matters of sustainability, and that city planning's portfolio would provide measures to sustain such a city. But at city planning, we were not given that as our task. Our efforts regarding matters that might seem as even impinging on sustainability were limited to providing copies of FEMA's floodplain elevations to new homeowners and to writing a plan for evacuation should a hurricane occur. I'll come back to say why we planners weren't tasked more broadly. But again, and for starters, how am I able to say something of importance about sustainability? As my husband Richard, who I married in this very town, says self-deprecatingly, you can't be too dumb, by which he means you really have to spell this out. You'll undoubtedly remember late August 2005, when Hurricane Katrina left 80% of New Orleans underwater for several days. Bear with me while I give you a short course concerning the particular environment of New Orleans, a city lying near the mouth of the Mississippi River, whose drainage includes an extraordinary system of rivers that flow through the American Midwest, where commodities such as wheat, corn, and soybeans are grown to be shipped to the rest of the world. The port facilities of New Orleans are the largest in the country by tonnage, a significant part of what sustains this nation's economy. Prior to 1900, the city survived hurricanes because most people lived in raised houses clustered on the Mississippi River's natural levee. Like all major rivers, the Mississippi had created these levees along its banks as annual spring floods overflowed the river's channel and then receded. What was left behind was the sediment. The coarsest sand and silt settled first, close to the banks of the river, creating the highest ground. Less coarse sediment traveled farther away from the banks of the river. Over the course of many millennia, the eventual result was a pair of sedimentary ridges known to geographers as natural levees that are parallel to the river and highest, closest to its banks. When New Orleans was founded in 1721, it was sited on the relatively wide, 10-foot-high natural levee ground of the eastern levee, on top of which French engineers constructed a man-made levee to afford the new city additional protection from flooding. The 2-mile-wide natural levee at New Orleans gently slopes north from the river toward Lake Pontchartrain. Before 1900, the high ground on the natural levees was where the New Orleans population mostly lived. Beyond it, farther toward the lake, nothing could be built because naturally occurring dense cypress swamps intervened. These geographic fundamentals defined communal life, economic life, and personal life in New Orleans, and in essence, determined the city's sustainability. The city in this configuration, relatively near the river, was sustainable. Early in New Orleans history, land was developed in a manner respectful of these constraints, and the city grew according to principles the great Scottish planner Ian McHarg defined in Design with Nature. Because the high ground was scarce in New Orleans, lots were small, thus allowing more people to live where it was dry. Furthermore, recognizing that very great spring floods were frequent, construction was built to endure. People lived in houses supported by piers so that floodwater could flow underneath. The houses were made of cypress, which was the wood found in the surrounding swamps and was able to withstand long periods of standing water. Floods, for these reasons, didn't ruin New Orleans. It was sustained, hurricane season after hurricane season. But despite the inherent and perhaps unnoticed wisdom of maintaining New Orleans within its natural constraints, municipal leaders wanted release from them. They longed to find a profitable use of the outlying cypress swamps that surrounded the city. Draining these swamps, various mayors reasoned, would allow the city to expand, thus enriching its economy. It's the ever-preoccupying question for civic officials, how to attract new development, thus providing the citizenry more jobs and services which, at least ostensibly, preserves the city as we know it and like it. The answer in New Orleans, wise or not, was to create more buildable land. For these reasons, in the early 1800s, the city constructed ditches to drain swamps into Lake Pontchartrain. These efforts, however, didn't succeed, as the ditches couldn't overcome the topographical dilemma of New Orleans actually lying below the level of the lake. The water simply wouldn't drain that way, and the city remained in relatively sustainable circumstances. But by the turn of the 20th century, Alfred Baldwin Wood, a native New Orleanian, invented a mechanical pump capable of lifting great quantities of water, even water containing tree trunks and other large debris. City leaders could now see a new future, and they authorized using the previous ditches to drain the cypress swamps using Mr. Wood's pumps. The land thus recovered by drainage was low and required levees to be constructed along the old ditches, which the city now romantically referred to as canals, reminiscent of Venice. By 1926, most of the swamps had been drained and the canals were complete, although the water within them was often incongruously higher than the surrounding recovered land. The City Planning Commission enthused that formerly uninhabitable land was now ready for construction and predicted that as many as 1.5 million people would eventually live in New Orleans. Urbanization didn't happen as quickly as the Planning Commission supposed. The stock market crash of 1929, the Depression, and World War II all came in the way and retarded growth. But during the 1950s, home building had begun to boom in New Orleans as it did throughout the country. Buyers could receive federally guaranteed mortgages, and they could buy newly popular ranch-style homes built on large lots and surrounded by lawns. Lakeview, alongside the 17th Street Canal, was New Orleans' first post-war subdivision. Single-family homes appeared on reclaimed land at grade, and lawns were grown on what had been swamplands. Houses in this new neighborhood were built improvidently and for reasons of cost, not raised above the level of predictable floods. Lots were no longer small. Construction materials were no longer resistant to water. Instead of using the previously favored cypress in the houses, contractor used wallboard. The constraints of New Orleans' natural, sustainable existence seemed exceeded, and the city started down a path toward hazard, though new homeowners in Lakeview felt as safe as those who lived on the natural levees. Other things happened in New Orleans, also typical of post-war America. Starting in the 1960s, white flight sent families out of New Orleans and into neighboring Jefferson Parish. Land developers schemed to compete by draining even more swamps. The City Council allowed 50 square miles of newly buildable, albeit below sea level, land to be subdivided in the eastern reaches of municipal boundaries. By the time this land was drained and developed in the mid-1970s, most of the original target market, white families, were already gone. And now suburban developments in New Orleans East attracted middle-class black families who left the old central city behind. This was black flight. But residents of New Orleans East felt safe, protected by levees separating them from Lake Pontchartrain and the river's flood zone. All of this history, of course, came to light after Hurricane Katrina, when 80% of the city flooded and citizens realized how false and how tragic their feeling of certain safety was for neighborhoods built on land recovered from the swamps after 1900. Lakeview, for example, was several feet underwater when the levees on the 17th Street Canal gave way. In vivid contrast, neighborhoods built on the original natural levees alongside the river suffered little damage. Most of these areas were dry overnight, while Lakeview stood 10 feet underwater for nearly 2 weeks. New Orleans East was completely flooded. In purely historic terms, if a street appeared on a city map drawn before 1900, the houses on that street were likely undamaged by Hurricane Katrina. But after 1900, much of the rest of New Orleans had grown perilously and was environmentally unsustainable in its own native geography. What a map showing the floods doesn't properly show are at least 5 other ways in which the city of New Orleans had become unsustainable by August of 2005. First, development of New Orleans East increased by 50% the city's land area to which urban services had to be extended. This expansion required a 50% increase in the cost of services, which in all cities is primarily paid for by property tax collections. Unfortunately, New Orleans was developed 10 years after the city's population had begun to decline from its highest point, when in 1960, 600,000 people lived in New Orleans. There were fewer total taxes collected, while the city had to pay for public services to the newly developed land while continuing to provide services to the old. The services were garbage collection, street repair, police and fire protection, recreational activities for young people, libraries for adults, and schools. The quality of all these services declined as the city overreached and was living, in essence, well beyond its means. You could say the budget for expenditures and maintenance was unsustainable. Second, because the budget was unsustainable, maintenance of vital infrastructure was deferred. For example, New Orleans relies on the Sewage and Water Board's pumps to drain water wherever it rains. Remember that the city is below sea level. All these pumps failed famously after Hurricane Katrina, but the city for years had failed routinely to maintain these pumps that typify how we keep the city dry after the thunderstorms that occur in New Orleans every month of the year. The pumps were under-maintained, we all knew, but we didn't conceptualize it as a characteristic of a city unable to sustain itself, though we might have. A third crucial result of the city's unsustainable municipal budget was that New Orleans offered a poorly educated workforce, the result of an underfunded public school system. As a consequence, the city had a poor record of attracting and keeping new industry. For example, no firm made products from the cargo passing through the Port of New Orleans. The port's economic activity instead was to transfer commodities from one mode of conveyance to another, from rail cars to ships, from ships to rail cars. These were jobs the city's labor force could perform. But hopes for a wider industrial economy dependent on an improving educational system simply could not be sustained. Fourth, and without new industries, New Orleans experienced a downward spiral toward dependence on tourism, notorious for narrow profit margins and poorly paid workforces. Poorly educated citizens could find only poorly paid jobs, which offered few opportunities for advancement. Intelligent children, whose parents could afford it, went elsewhere to school, elsewhere to work after graduation. As a result, replenished community life from younger generations also could not be sustained. And last, when people moved to the new areas in town, Lakeview and New Orleans East, left behind were the older, low-lying parts of town. New Orleans had more vacant and abandoned property than any other city in the nation. Crime was rampant, safe community life wasn't being sustained. The problems New Orleans faced simply to sustain itself were grave and interconnected, as you can see. But suggestions for solving them were not to be found in the city's plan for the future because there was no way, political or otherwise, to figure out how to undo the manner in which New Orleans had developed. In effect, planning meant, as always, facing where people lived and where commerce operated. You could say that planning proceeded along, not paying attention to first principle matters, and instead focused on routine planning issues as if New Orleans were a city not threatened by hurricanes. My office advised the City Council on such ordinary land use matters as subdivision proposals and zoning changes. We rewrote our portfolio of plans and regulations, much of which hadn't been revised in 20 years. We were very busy, but not with creating strategies that would return the city to its long-forgotten sustainable past circumstance. Such concerns would not have achieved a place on the public agenda because they did not seem urgent to a population and a set of leaders who felt both confident of their safety and preoccupied by more attractive matters. But then a hurricane of dire consequence did come along, and amidst many other dramatic exactions, provided a new grammar and diction in New Orleans, one component of which was in fact sustainability. We hadn't thought about sustaining ourselves before, but now it became urgent that we do that. City planning was of course set back on its heels by Katrina. It had no plan for rebuilding, sustainable or not. But because of the horrifying devastation the storm caused, expert planners, economists, and developers who did know about sustainability offered to come to New Orleans to assist in creating such a plan. The lead planner of this group, John Beckman, had consulted with New Orleans City Planning for many years and knew the city well. Mr. Beckman worked for Ian McHarg's consulting firm, and the plans he had written were always typified by an emphasis on there being a crucial connection between a city and its natural environment. Because of his arrival, a worthy plan seemed in the works, and citizens expected it would quickly materialize. As I'll explain presently, the plan for New Orleans was never completed, but the plan itself and the reasons for its failure offer many lessons pertinent to the subject of sustainability. It might seem odd to bring a failed plan to your attention, but I'm inspired by the civil engineer Henry Petrosky, author of a book called To Forgive Design, who argues that success is success, but that's all it is. Failure brings improvement. Let me return to post-Katrina New Orleans. Shortly after the storm, the mayor named prominent local businessmen to what was called the Bring New Orleans Back Commission and charged them with overseeing the newly arrived experts' efforts to write a plan for rebuilding our ruined city. Reporters interviewed members of the mayor's commission seeking news about the plan to impart to a worried but hopeful citizenry. When interviewed, the commissioners said the plan, as they understood Mr. Beckman's intention, would reduce the city's physical extent and would cluster housing on high ground. Everyone who lived in New Orleans would be safe in the future, they said, which sounded equitable. Two phrases explained the plan's strategies: shrink the city's footprint and increase residential density. Equitable or not, both phrases alienated the citizens who heard them. Shrink meant to them that some neighborhoods would not be rebuilt, that individuals would lose capital investments in their houses, even though in many cases those houses were no longer standing. Density, as applied to New Orleans, a sprawling and low-scale city composed mainly of small residences, density implied to citizens high-rise development on the natural levees. These two toxic phrases instantly divided the city. Citizens who already lived in the high ground areas became afraid of what would happen to the neighborhoods they'd return to after the storm. Residents of neighborhoods in the low-lying areas, most of whom had no economic means to return without government assistance, they were afraid they would never again live where they had lived, and worst case, they would never live in New Orleans at all. When the plan was unveiled by the commission, one image seemed to prove that citizens' fears were well-founded. The disturbing image was part of the plan that concentrated on parks and open space, and which consisted of a map of New Orleans on which 6 large areas had been circled with green dashes. These areas constituted much of the low-lying land ruinously flooded by Katrina. The commission announced that the green circled areas represented new parkland, where groundwater from future floods would naturally flow, and no residents would suffer harm because no one would be living there. Those in the audience who had lived in the encircled areas wondered, naturally enough, what was going to happen to them. Where would they live, eventually, or in a year? Other citizens wondered if people from the flooded areas were to be forced into the newly revived neighborhoods in the city's high ground neighborhoods. These were details to be worked out later, the mayor's commission answered. At this point, unfortunately, the mayor lost interest in his commission's work and sent them home. He never asked them to answer citizens' worries about densification and shrinking the footprint, about where they were going to live in the future, though these able planners could have. The plan was therefore never completed. Several more plans were subsequently drafted, all of which were likewise set aside. Eventually, a new plan was in fact adopted, which meant the city could finally receive the funds for reconstruction President Bush promised immediately after the storm, which by that time had been 3 years ago. The final plan adopted for New Orleans merely envisioned the city rebuilt as it had been before Hurricane Katrina, in willful disregard of the city's quite dramatic and evident unsustainability. Oh, there is water here. You said there was, Lauren, I forgot. It's odd to be talking about flooding so much and have a dry throat. The final plan adopted for New Orleans envisioned rebuilding the city as it had been. True, the Army Corps of Engineers spent more than $15 billion to restore the levees and install floodgates across all drainage canals, and citizens felt they could trust their safety in the event of a Category 3 hurricane. Of course, Hurricane Katrina had been a Category 4 storm, and much of the city was still below sea level. In many people's view, mine included, New Orleans had missed a singular chance to rebuild to a condition that existed before 1900, when it could sustain itself against hurricanes because inundatable land was not considered buildable. Scholars interested in disaster recovery today forgive the city for missing this opportunity, pointing out that reimagining how a city should be built is nearly impossible immediately after mass destruction, when people want no more than to return home and get their boarded up houses back in operation, no matter how defenseless the locations remain. You could call this a longing for certainty in the future and understand it. However, I see in New Orleanians' longings for certainty a useful guide for planning for sustainability. William Ruckelshaus, an early head of the EPA, says that taking charge of the future requires getting science closer to policy. Hurricane Katrina got science close to policy, one might say, by revealing the factors that led to the disaster. But policymakers shied away from addressing those factors when they halted work on the Bring New Orleans Back plan. In the fraught circumstances of the time, that's probably not surprising. But in ordinary times, before the effects of climate change start to ruin cities, a planner's job is to locate vulnerability and devise policies to prevent its effects. This is an ongoing, unending task for the obvious reason that scientists learn more every year about how the Earth can be made more environmentally sustainable. Most American states have archives of scientific information about areas within their jurisdiction at danger from climate change. Such important information about environmental vulnerability is typically found in academic institutions such as LSU's Hurricane Center or in federal agencies such as FEMA. But if a region has no such information, planners can convene experts to create it. In addition to this effort, I suggest planners replicate the analysis I performed, which considered several non-environmental factors that rendered New Orleans unsustainable: the inadequate municipal budget, the poor quality of city services, the unskilled labor force. Based on such information and analysis, planners can write what I will provisionally call a sustainability plan. I'll keep the word sustainable in quotation marks to remind us more is required to make a city sustainable than writing a plan. A quote sustainability plan would offer several alternative future development schemes for achieving sustainability. In the tense and expectant weeks following Hurricane Katrina, the Bring New Orleans Back Commission couldn't allow planners the time to devise alternatives and bring them to the public for discussion. Urgency prevailed as thousands of New Orleanians were homeless and scattered across the nation. But in ordinary times, and in advance of feeling the effects of climate change, planners should work out different scenarios for sustainable development and engage in a comprehensive public review to find the preferred choice. A sustainability plan would be quite different from most city plans, which use a genial, hopeful vocabulary to describe what future land use patterns should be, and typically excuse problems that previous development caused by casting them as opportunities. Implicit in this is that the future seems both certain and achievable. An example comes from a plan written before Hurricane Katrina. I wrote this. There are extensive opportunities for future development of vacant parcels in New Orleans East, many of which are multi-thousand-acre lots that represent not only population increases, but also significant potential employment. This misleadingly hopeful language does not describe the fierce error New Orleans made when it allowed New Orleans East to be developed. But the vocabulary does reveal the underlying premise of most plans, that the local economy will improve as population increases, and as it does, all citizens will somehow benefit and problems will somehow be solved. I think planners' vocabulary must be different from what I just quoted when dealing with matters of sustainability. The words we choose to describe the likely future must be candid, and the plans we write must start with a frank assessment of the areas in a city vulnerable to, for example, flooding that global warming will cause. Yikes. But no siren, no siren. With a candid sustainability plan, planners next devise strategies for executing the plan. Planners know how to seek out a wide array of implementation measures, ranging from zoning regulations to bond issues for taxation policies. But planners can do more. I suggest that planning offices in City Hall designate sustainability planners and charge them with staying abreast of relevant science and successful implementation efforts. I'll have more to say about functions of sustainability planners later, but at this point, I'll emphasize that the trouble with planning for sustainability is not what we don't know or can't find out. It's the practical difficulty of persuading leaders to adopt and follow them. Addressing that practical difficulty is the subject of the remainder of my talk. As I said at the beginning of the lecture, sustainability is now invoked whenever the future is described. To test this observation, I compiled a list of all the ways sustainable was used in the bundle of things I read on a single day: the newspaper, emails, catalogs, fundraising appeals, notices from the American Planning Association. The resulting list reminded me of what the entertainingly witty playwright Ben Jonson wrote in around 1600. Wheresoever manners and fashions are corrupted, language is. It imitates the public riot. The word sustainability has become commonplace, used to apply to situations from the trivial to the profound. I even saw a pair of shoes in the Neiman Marcus catalog that claimed they were sustainable. I love shoes, and they're many things, but sustainable they ain't. The word sustainable has become, the word's actual meaning is lost in this riot of usage. In Johnson's phrasing, the word is corrupted. I'll talk about the effect this corrupted word has on planners because we can do something about our use of language. Then I'll talk about the public's riotous usage of sustainability. We probably can't change citizens' affection for slogans, but we can try to turn their affection to meaningful public action. And finally, I'll talk about people who don't use sustainability, those unconvinced that the subject deserves a place on society's agenda. I believe planners are trained to perform the most important tasks of government, to look to the future, to advise on issues regarding a city's physical development, to think of how to use every asset of a city. To my mind, planning both tries to fix what's wrong and also does the harder thing, to identify and bring about what's best. The pursuit of and reliance on a slogan such as sustainability is inadequate to these tasks of planning, and worse. Slogans actually undermine planners' professional abilities. The way this happens is insidious. Every person who uses the word and every person who hears the word used assumes their private understanding of it is correct and that it's mutually agreed upon. But when we use a word on the assumption that everyone agrees to our meaning, we are unable to move from abstraction, which hides conflicts and contradictions. The result is that we can't agree about what exactly we're talking about, and therefore we can't agree about what a plan to achieve, say, sustainability would include. I think planners can only be effective when they engage all the competing and even contradictory factors involved in sustainability. What can we do about our dilemma? The answer seems linguistically obvious. Planners must define the word sustainability whenever they invoke it. The United Nations World Commission made an early attempt to define sustainability, writing in 1987 that it meant development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. 2 years later, the head of the EPA, William Ruckelshaus, tried to flesh the World Commission's definition out, saying the doctrine of sustainability recognized that economic growth and development must take place and must be maintained over time within the limits set by ecology, which he defined in the broad sense as the interrelations of human beings and their works, the biosphere and the physical and chemical and man-made laws that govern it. This definition pulls together different forces that must be considered when we think about how to sustain community life. To work this out requires the kind of effort that I've described in New Orleans that led to the Bring New Orleans Back plan. Planners can write candid sustainability plans. We know how. You'll perhaps be surprised at my advice dealing with citizens' reliance on slogans. As I said, we can't control how citizens choose to use words, but we can recognize citizens' reliance as evidence of their interest and turn that interest into political action. That's one more lesson we can take from the failed Bring New Orleans Back plan. The men working on this plan didn't attend to a basic rule of politics. To get an elected leader's attention and support, get the attention and support of his or her constituents. The Commission's failure doomed its plan, although I forgive this failure given the exigent pressure of the time. But planners who've created a sustainability plan must create public support among citizens. This means planners must organize their advocates. We know that political power of citizen organizations is strong, particularly in wealthier neighborhoods convinced that zoning, for example, maintains high property values. But we also know that poorer neighborhoods are less aware of the value of planning mechanisms and haven't organized such groups. I'll return to New Orleans for a pertinent suggestion. There was a time in the city when there was a loud public controversy over a particular revision to the zoning ordinance. The mayor of New Orleans and I formed a citizens advisory council and asked for volunteers to serve. We felt the public controversy ensured there would be volunteers, and there were. We divided the city into 20 districts and chose one volunteer from each. We thereby created a cohort of citizens who might take a larger, longer-lasting interest in planning. Our only criterion for selection was that a volunteer did not already belong to a neighborhood organization. The citizen advisors attended weekly briefing sessions in which my staff and I discussed plans and zoning. It was like a public seminar. Over time, the advisors became known, even in areas that had very strong neighborhood organizations, as the individuals to call when you wanted to know about a planning controversy. In a similar fashion, planners could create a sustainability advisory council composed of interested volunteers and educate them about sustainability, what the word means and how it informs the plan and how the plan can be put into effect. Gradually, the individuals on the Sustainability Advisory Council would become known as who to ask about sustainability matters. You can see my objective, I'm sure, is to broaden the number of people who support the Planning Office's sustainability plan. I have one more suggestion for turning the riot of enthusiasm citizens have for sustainability to good public policy. I trust I've made a case for the necessity of defining sustainability. Now I'm suggesting planners involve citizens in this effort. To guide our choice of language, planners could create a panel of citizens interested in clarity and understandability. The only qualification for becoming a member of this Citizen Clarity Council would be a person's willingness to speak up, to say, I don't understand what you mean. In other words, citizens should edit planners' explanations. Daniel Moynihan said, planning takes a lot of words, referring, I've always thought, to how much planners know about cities, which is comprehensive and complicated. Everything is connected to everything else, as Mr. Moynihan and the rest of us learned from Barry Commoner. My point is that better use of language can guide planners out of the thicket of planning verbiage, and citizens can help us in our choice of words. I think this activity will stimulate the citizens' continued interest in matters of, quote, sustainability. Planners can make another effective use of citizens' enthusiasm for the slogan sustainability. I suggest that what I've called sustainability planners be charged with developing strategies for involving citizens and include such strategies as complementary parts of the sustainability plan. But knowing that people lose interest in almost any activity once its novelty has worn off, I see that a citizenry's enthusiasm must be replenished. In effect, planners must sustain the attention of citizens already interested and recruit new enthusiasts. One well-known mechanism is to set measurable goals for what citizens can accomplish and then report on progress toward achieving those goals. But planners must also regularly inaugurate new activities for citizens. Sustainability planners, in my conception, are avid hunters of the new science, new implementation strategy, and newly proven efforts for increasing environmental, economic, and social sustainability. I can speak confidently about how fine academic research into citizen participation has greatly informed how local government planners interact with the public. What we need next is dedicated research into how to keep the public's interest engaged in the most important matters facing our society. We simply don't have a reliable arsenal of methods, nor an understanding beyond anecdote about why one or another method to keep interest in sustainability might fail or succeed. I finally want to speak about what I referred to as unconvinced citizens, those who don't think sustainability is a proper policy for government to pursue and would oppose efforts to write a plan so as to withstand effects of climate change. I'm of course referring to land developers, chambers of commerce, business organizations such as home builders and realtors. Planners must seek these antagonists out, spend effort learning about their reasons for opposition, go to their meetings, write back to people who send letters to the newspaper. This is simply a suggestive list of activities, but the point is planners must keep up with their opponents. They are citizens and constituents of elected leaders too. I could go on, of course, and it probably wouldn't surprise you to learn that I'd finally get around to how the logic of regional government is connected to sustainability, but I'll restrain myself, and I hope sustain your patience for a few concluding remarks. I've made several suggestions this evening. I've talked about how to plan in advance of disasters caused by climate change, using the example of New Orleans before and after Hurricane Katrina. The result would be creditable sustainability plans. I've suggested that planners must improve the clarity of their language, and I've suggested that planners attend to the political power of citizens to influence elected leaders to rely on sustainability plans. Astute planners would create a cohort of advocates, and I've assigned a task to such institutions as the Clinton School, devote some research efforts to learning how to sustain citizens' interest in sustainability. Taken together, my suggestions guide planners in their sober mission to make it possible for all citizens, irrespective of their means, to live under conditions favorable to health, happiness, and productive efficiency. As I near the end of these remarks, I'll remind you of what Lewis Mumford answered when he was asked about the future of cities. "I'm hopeful about the possibilities, pessimistic about the probabilities," he said. I've offered my remarks tonight in an optimistic vein, hoping to improve the odds that planners are able to persuade policymakers to adopt their ideas. And I'll give George Orwell the final word, this from his essay, Politics in the English Language. He was lamenting what he saw as the ugliness of language, which he said was being used to describe foolish thoughts. He thought ugly language, what Johnson would have called its corruption, makes it easier to have trivial, foolish thoughts. He explains the mechanism by which this occurs in his essay, but before he explains the connection between ugly language and foolish thoughts, he says the process is reversible. If Orwell can think the process is reversible, I can think we can make good use of the fashionable slogan, sustainability. And that makes me less pessimistic about Mumford, about the possibilities for planning to help society and Central Arkansas achieve sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we've got some time for questions. If anyone has a question, please raise their hand. Abby?
Hi, thank you for coming. I'm Abby Olivier, a first-year student at the Clinton School, and I'm a recent graduate of the University of Mississippi, and I was in the Law Institute, but didn't get to take your class. But thank you for coming. Today I had an opportunity to meet a local that many people probably know, Dr. Sharice West, and she's the president of the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, but she was the founding director of the Louisiana Disaster Relief Foundation, which is now the Foundation of Louisiana. I was wondering, you're talking a lot about, civic engagement and sustainability plans. Is there a role in city planning for collaboration with private foundations in that work? Because of, a lot of foundations, for example, the Louisiana Disaster Relief Fund was for immediate relief, but now they're looking into, systemic change and social change. Is there a place for private foundation work?
Oh, absolutely, there's a role for them. I mean, one of the things I think, the title of the book that I wrote is called The Trouble with City Planning, and I think there are three troubles. I think planners write plans that only planners can read. They also do not access the knowledge that ordinary citizens have about planning and about their cities. I mean, most people are urban planners. If they live in a city, they're urban planners by circumstance. They can tell you the processes that work in a neighborhood. What is typical when developing plans, and I should say, as I said before, I don't criticize anything I haven't done myself, okay? So when setting out to work on a land use plan, we would usually contact neighborhood organizations. I mean, that's the standard model that everybody learns in planning school, and we would do that. And we didn't broaden our reach to include all of the other people who are interested in city planning. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. A lot of those organizations don't think the plan is going to do them any good in the first place, so why should they bother doing it, which my book also tries to explain. But I think, the not-for-profit organizations have a great role to play. I mean, you could say that the reason that New Orleans has so much historic preservation is precisely because of the strength of the not-for-profit preservationist groups. So yes, indeed, wonderful idea.
Yes, sir, got a question right back here. Here, the microphone's coming to you.
No.
Yeah, I just want to say that I've been going to New Orleans since I was a kid and read a lot about it and go there all the time. I don't think I've ever heard such a complete and interesting recap of the history of how the city
Well, thank you.
got to where it is, as you
thank you.
gave us tonight. I mean, it's just amazing. You know,
Well,
I mean,
thank
for
you.
the first time, I was kind of light, you know, went on. Yeah, thank you.
Sure, thank you.
I just had a quick question, kind of a follow-up on that question. I was wondering of your impressions of the results of the so-called Brad Pitt project in New Orleans, you know, where a celebrity, well-meaning, comes in, kind of makes a splash. You know, does that kind of thing work? Did it stimulate a lot of other things to happen? I mean, what's the conclusion on that?
Well, you know, I will speak very frankly about that. I think those houses are trinkets, and they were wildly expensive to build. I think he has lost interest in them because they cost so much money, even though at the time his aspiration was a good aspiration. I mean, a lot of people who came to New Orleans right after that disaster really wanted to help. And he had the money to try to help, and he also has an interest in architecture, and he thought he could design a building which had some reference to the standard, you know, the shotgun houses that there are in New Orleans, and have them raised and so forth. And so the people who live there, I mean, it's fine. It's a fine little part of the Lower Ninth Ward. It's just that it's sort of an island, because the Lower Ninth Ward is the frontier now. And but there are many other similar enthusiasms that went on around that city, and some of them have worked, and they looked odd at first. I mean, I will say this about Brad Pitt's houses. In that environment, the ground is very fertile, and there are a lot of plants that grow there, and so those houses will finally soften. I mean, some of them now are covered over with that ginger, the kind of climbing ginger that has no fragrance. But other people came, and the Tulane Architecture School took a lead in trying to design new prototypes in Tremé, which is right across Rampart Street from the French Quarter, and tried to do, in a way, something similar to what Brad Pitt did, which was to design a house which was affordable and that was raised so that water could flow under. So there were a great number of different enthusiasms. I can tell you that when I went back down to be the chief of staff, I met with HUD had offered to give New Orleans some help with some of the entitlement programs and how it was being used. And the woman came, who's one of the assistant secretaries of HUD, and I was in a meeting with her, and she looked around there and she said, how has the city redeveloped so far? And I said, well, if I were to look at it just objectively, I would say it had been developed on the theory of every man for himself. And she said, that's what I think too. And it's because the enthusiasm, which were well-meaning by very many people, I mean, the Habitat has a musicians village, which is in the 9th Ward, Brad Pitt stuff in the Lower 9th Ward, scattered all around town are various things, but they are scattered. Their governments seem to just go away. And I mean, what Mayor Nagin had said after he sent the Bring New Orleans Back Commission home was he would let the market decide what part of the city was going to be rebuilt. And that is what happened. And so it's, you know, so all of those ideas, they were worthwhile ideas, but they were allowed simply to occur in isolation and not create, say, a center of gravity, which would then make all of the Lower 9th Ward perhaps better, whatever. Did that answer you? Okay.
Michael, question right back here.
Dr. Ford, that was a really enlightening lecture that you gave.
Thank you.
I wrote down a note and passed it next to Tamara, and I said, she's so candid. And I literally wrote that. And going back to that comment you made when you were critiquing...
Is that the siren? No.
Going back...
I think I can hear you.
Okay. Well, going back to that comment that you made critiquing your own plan that you had made, do you have any recommendations to the students at the Clinton School, you know, as they move forward? they're going to face the pressure to deliver their analysis, their work, through a rose-colored lens. And that makes the elected officials look good and feel good. And sometimes we want to believe only the best, and we don't want to look at the hard truths. So how would you recommend being more candid as you write?
Well, your question is actually extremely astute. I can be candid. I could be candid. I was this candid when I was at work there. But it was because, and in this way, my answer isn't going to actually quite answer you. But I knew enough. I'm not from New Orleans. I'm white. At the time, the city was 2/3 black. And I'm a woman, which back in the day, I would be in a meeting, so I was the only woman in the room. Okay, so it was amazing. But I recognized what I needed to do to fit into this environment was to keep my mouth shut for a while and just listen to people, and then take on little. People would call me and ask me to come speak to a community group, and they were nervous. I mean, I have a PhD in planning, and I think they were afraid what I'm going to do is come down and tell them what their neighborhood ought to look like. And I could, in these early speeches, say, city planning is not the repository of good ideas. You all are. You're the ones who live here. What we're good at is figuring out how to make what you think is a good idea actually work and fit in with all of the other good ideas that you might otherwise disrupt. And then, and I took that attitude and I spoke to anybody who wanted to talk to me. And then I had some hard decisions that I had to make really early in the position. And I just, I think people came to trust I would say what I thought, but that I wasn't trying to impose on anybody what I thought was a superior point of view. And then gradually, when people got used to that and used to how I conducted myself, then I could be more candid even in talking to a district councilman and say, this idea that you're supporting is really a bad idea, and here's why. Now that's going to be tough for you all to do because you are doing projects. I know a little bit about Laura's. You're doing projects in which you don't have a chance to establish your bona fides as somebody who has a legitimate point of view they should listen to. And so you are going to pull your punches. On the other hand, one of the things you could do is if you're going to give a report, say you have something that you've written, I'll use Laura's example for the Heifer Foundation. Hippie, I'm sorry, I'm thinking about Heifer. Hippie. That you could, if you have something that you want to say that you think is going to be a little blunt and not really what they're used to hearing or in the language they're used to hearing it, go and meet with them with the first draft. So that everybody hates a surprise. What my profession does, here's what we do. What you really think is, that is the worst design subdivision I have ever seen. But instead you say, I have some concerns about this design you have. And so you get to see, you can work on your own language so that you don't give somebody a left of the jaw, but you can also recognize that surprise is what really frightens people and gets them put on the spot. So if you are going to say something tough, give them a chance to see it ahead of time.
Microphone coming right at you.
I like your observations about language and the challenge of language pertaining to the word sustainable. Mm-hmm. And we face the same challenge when we try to define smart growth back a decade ago. And aren't those new words just another words of good planning principles that we really had predating World War II and after World War II, huge social programs of subsidized housing loans, highway construction, and rapid technology of development patterns overwhelmed good principles. So sustainability is really restoring good planning principles that are time-tested. Is that?
That's what I think. I think sustainability is old wine, new bottle. I mean, you're right, it is smart growth. And by the way, everybody's sick of sustainability. When you see the Neiman Marcus catalog, it is on its way out. But the new word that's stealing the march on sustainability is resilience. In New York, the Regional Plan Association is trying to do its 4th regional plan. They're calling it a resilient region. Well, resilient is a nicer word than sustainability, but it also has the wrong connotation to me. I mean, resilient means you bounce back, but as I said in this talk, I think that planners, we try to fix things, but we're also trying to identify what's better and to get there, and that's different from resilient. But I think planners, you know, the history of slogans is as old as the planning profession. Guys from advertising came to the first planning conventions, and they said, you know, the average person doesn't want to hear a long and complicated explanation. If you can think of a quick phrase, preferably a single word, then you don't have to explain all this stuff, and then people will be convinced. And that is as old as my profession, and what my profession is trying to do is it's always been the same. We're always trying to use resources well. We're against sprawl, okay? But you all know all of this because you're about to start on a plan. And I think the gentleman back there had a question.
And bear with us with the microphones. This is weather related, so just.
As a student of history, I like the idea that civilization is linked to cities. I want to believe that. But in America, the experience is like, well, there isn't much civilization in the cities. Do you see us maintaining a civilization, if you will, without cities or with crumbling cities all over us?
No, I don't. I mean, the cities, when you have people put together, I mean, I teach at Columbia now, and it's a very dense group of people with a lot of things on their mind, and it's quite exhilarating. I mean, I also live in rural Maine, which I also just love, but I think that the real creative forces and the kind of ideas that we need to get us through a period of climate change and of increasing population and all the problems that we all know about, that it's going to take, cities have to be the repository of civilization. I believe that. I think we don't know much about how to make them.
We have time for one more question right here.
Hi, thank you again for coming out tonight
Sure.
and being able to share what it is, your thoughts, and being candid about it. As a planner myself, I really enjoyed the discussion. And I was wanting to know, what are your feelings? Because whenever Hurricane Katrina and the planning, planning of that was going on, social media wasn't as prevalent as it is now. And so I think planners now are trying to find a way, just like with Metro Plan with the Create Central Arkansas here, is trying to find a way to bring about, you know, social media being able to play a way to where other people are having those voices. How do you see that being able to play a positive role? And then what are some of the drawbacks that you may see to having that to be another mechanism to help to plan our cities in the future?
Well, the answer to that is complicated. I mean, social media would certainly help during the immediate period after a disaster and in the period immediately before. People in New Orleans who were there after Katrina were telling me that, you know, telephones didn't work, and neither did cell phones at the time, but they all of them figured out some way to use their cell phone as a sort of pre-tweet or something, pre-Twitter. They figured out little codes so that they could speak to each other. And then those people could find each other and could find, you know, where there was food and where it was dangerous, so don't go. And so I think there's a role for that. I'm only a little concerned. I'll give you an example. This also is from the Regional Plan Association. They're very interested in developing their new 4th plan. And the Regional Plan Association is quite old and venerable and so forth. And so they had a little practice session that I went to the other day in which people who had Facebook or who could text, who could text, it was a big room of 120 people, and they said, okay, so for all of you who can text, we're going to have some opinions. So they had some questions up here. And if you agree or disagree, then you did something, and they texted. Well, I really didn't like what they were doing. There's a part of me that I love survey research, but they were asked, here's one of the questions. Do you agree or disagree? How strongly do you agree or disagree with this statement that increased transparency in governmental decision will lead to more efficient government? And I said to her, you're asking two questions. I mean, I don't know what transparency means in the first place, and I'm a little suspicious of the word whenever I hear it used. So do I answer, I disagree with that, but I think that it might lead, if it's understood the way that I think it should be understood, will it lead to more efficient decisions, and then what are those? And so you see my point. I said to them, y'all need to do a lot more work on your questions so that when you get the response from this texting stuff, that it means something. Otherwise, you just have to garbled, garbage in, garbage out, right, that old phrase. And I think, and I tried to say this delicately, but they have decided that they're going to put that part of this idea off until they can work on it a little more. So there's the danger, is that a lot of stuff that I see on social media isn't very well thought through, and it kind of, it's going to take some careful thinking to figure out how it fits in, but that isn't to say that it can't. I mean, the more people I can get interested in planning and involved in it, and to make their feelings known, the better chance planning has to be successful. But I just think, I don't think you can jump on new technology just willy-nilly,
Let's thank Kristina Ford very much for being here.